Hello and welcome to Soberania, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City, as well as staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And some bad news today. Unfortunately, Kurt has got a busy schedule. He won't be able to join us today, so I'll be flying this plane solo. Wish me luck. Let's get started.
So, here I am.
You made it!
Thank you very much. Don't
I
count
think-
me out, Jose Luis. Don't count me out.
Excellent. Good Kramer-style intro there.
Thank you very much. My name is Pete
I know
Henderson.
our viewers and listeners were maybe a little worried that you weren't going to be here, but hey,
Yeah.
we can always count on you.
fans, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico. I've got my official Soberania Cappuccino, my official Soberania Mineral Water, and ready for a hotel room edition of Soberania.
Hotel room is proof that Kurt is actually busy, but he's always making time for us here for Soberania.
The dawn seeping through these hotel room curtains, actually.
Yeah.
So, we're up early.
Okay, so on today's program, we're going to be talking about the situation that Mexico is facing with Donald Trump being elected president, as well as a new leadership for the right-wing opposition National Action Party, the PAN, and the usual good news from Mexico, losers and haters, as always. For those of you who maybe missed us, last week we did a special live episode, considering there were so many things happening on Tuesday. Didn't make sense for us to do a pre-recorded episode. We went live. You can check that out on our YouTube page, and we uploaded a slightly edited version on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for you, those of you who are listening us through there. So, but we're back to normal, back to regular programming today, and we are ready to begin. Okay, so we're here to talk about the obvious. We said we would talk about this in this episode, on our live episode, saying, there's a lot to break down here, but also I think I want to start by saying we shouldn't get too worked up. The truth is that yes, there are risks, but a lot of people are overstating, I think, deliberately so, with political intentions, what a Trump presidency could mean for Mexico. And we have here this headline from The Guardian. Sheinbaum, Mexican president, tells Mexicans stunning Trump win is, quote, nothing to worry about. President reassures her country as threat of U.S. tariffs and deportations looms. Kurt, what do you think? Something to worry about? Do you agree with the president? What are your feelings on the U.S. election, being someone who lived so many years there, and its implications for Mexico, as always, here on the Soberania podcast, bringing you news and analysis about Mexico?
Well, there's a lot to say on this point, Jose Luis, and I think the first point to make is the point that you just started this segment with, is that there are elements on both sides of the border that want to play up this news for political purposes, and that you have to push back against right at the start, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but you have Mexico's right wing, an utter failure, They just elected a new fail-son leader. What they want to do is to play this whole thing up so that Trump can do what they've been unable to do at the polls, right? And this is the MO of Mexico's right wing, basically forever in the history of Mexico, right? So that's one point, right? Be careful of those who would play this up and sound alarm, blah, 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 in order to do what they are unable to do politically. The second point, and this is a point I made in a tweet a few days back, is that be careful with your analysis as well. Some people's analysis is still stuck in 2016. Right? This is not the same Mexico as in 2016. This is a stronger Mexico. It's a more sovereign Mexico, and it's a more energy sufficient Mexico, right? So in 2018, when AMLO took power, just to give an example, right? Because Trump's tariff threat came in 2019. Right? At that point, Mexico was not self-sufficient in energy. Mexico had 4 or 5 days of gasoline reserves on hand. So if the United States had wanted to turn off the gasoline spigots, what kind of leverage did Mexico have in negotiations? 2024, fast forward, Mexico is now practically energy self-sufficient with its new refinery in Deer Park, with its remodeling of the other refineries, with its, Dos Bocas, with the Deer Park refinery. That gives Mexico alone a great deal more of leverage to resist U.S. threats, because they can't just say, all right, we'll turn off here or whatever. So sovereignty is foreign policy, and that's something that we need to talk more about, and we'll be talking more about as this whole situation unfolds. We see here on the screen a tweet of mine that says, Mexico has pieces to move and it must move them. And this is a reference to a great Twitter account, Samuel, who pointed out that Xi Jinping, the Chinese premier, has requested a meeting with Claudia Sheinbaum at the upcoming G20 summit in Brazil. Claudia Sheinbaum will be attending the first day of that summit, and of course, we'll be giving you more news about that as it comes along. So this is not the same Mexico as in 2016. And of course, there's much stronger leadership. Imagine the prostrate leadership of Peña Nieto back in 2016, the rampant kleptocracy of Mexico compared to what we've been talking about now. This is also not the same U.S. as in 2016. This is the United States that is much more heavily indebted, that is much more heavily with, bad macroeconomic numbers, much more, even worse polarization at home, and overextended abroad. This is the United States that has been pouring money into the black hole of the Ukraine war, and Ukraine is losing, folks. So what's going to happen if Ukraine falls in the first weeks of a Trump presidency, the first months of a Trump presidency? You think Trump is going to stop the war in Ukraine? I've got another horse to sell you. That he'll keep pouring money into Ukraine. I think that's a pretty safe bet. The genocide in Israel-Palestine, Israel's losing in Lebanon. What's going to happen over there? The United States is going to keep pouring money and arms into that, ongoing war crime and massacre. Right now, there's China. The United States is doing everything possible to provoke a new conflict with China. They tried to do that through Taiwan. Didn't work as planned. So now they're trying to provoke it through the Philippines, which has been making now new territorial claims for islands, which are in dispute in the Pacific. They're saying, oh, they're ours. And the U.S., of course, has a mutual defense agreement with the Philippines. So they're finding ways to try to up tensions in the Pacific. This is an overextended, ailing empire, Jose Luis. Do you think they have the same leverage to twist Mexico's arm as before? No, they do not. No, they do not. And one of the reasons Kamala lost was because of high prices. Yeah. High prices in the grocery store, high prices for gasoline, high prices for this, high prices for that. What would a tariff threat to Mexico provide? Higher prices for the U.S. consumer. The U.S. is no longer a manufacturing society, and as Marcelo Ebrard, Mexico's economic secretary, has pointed out, they're not going to be. That ship has sailed because of rampant neoliberal globalization. Do you think the United States is in that easy of a position to just take out the tariff machine gun? China will retaliate. There will be counter tariffs. And Mexico, and I think this is something that we need to discuss a lot more on this show, is not exempt of its own means to push back on these things. It's not just a passive country saying, oh no, Mr. Trump, please don't, impose tariffs on us. This is the United States' largest trading power. We see trading partner. We see this on the screen right now. Your tweet lays it out. While a Trump presidency represents risks, don't get confused. The U.S. economy is highly dependent on Mexico, and not just highly dependent on Mexican imports, right? Before the idea was, it's just cheap raw materials and cheap labor. It's much more involved than that nowadays. The supply chains are totally interwoven between the pieces, between the countries. So you'll see U.S. products that cross the border one way, cross the border back, cross the border 4 or 5 times before it gets to a finished product. So it's not just imports in block. It's interdependent supply and production chains. Just try interrupting those and see what happens. Just try provoking the Tigre in Mexico and see what that would provoke with regards to protests, with regards to labor disruptions in the maquiladoras, with regards to, real pushback from the bases in Mexico. If they were to dare to go through this, outlandish idea of bombing Mexico, that would stop maquiladora production. That would create immediate, labor movements and popular movements, and the border pressures would be immense. Do they want to let that genie out of the bottle? All of this is by way of saying, just to summarize, that those who wish badly on Mexico through Trump, by means of Trump, are traitors. And they're not living in the same world. They're not living in the same world as, an objective analysis would present, Jose Luis. It's not just, oh, you're not gonna behave, you're gonna get the tariffs. Okay. All right. Let's see.
We'll see. We'll see. I wanted to return your point. I think a lot of people continue to insist on seeing the situation as if it were Trump won 2016. It's not the same. And I think in particular, one thing that I would point to is the fact that there are consequences to US policy decisions. We saw Trump begin his aggressive position towards China during his first presidency. And we saw that Biden largely continued that. You touched on a couple of points, this instigation vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis the Philippines, with the famous CHIPS Act, these efforts to try to restrict the access of silicone chips to China and actually trying to affect their ability to continue to progress technologically. But those have consequences. And I think a lot of what we see here on the screen, which is showing that Mexico is the largest trading partner of the United States, is in part a consequence of those decisions that were made by both the Republican and Democrat White Houses. And that means that now Mexico is in a very, very different negotiating position than it was earlier. And like you said, also with a different kind of leadership, right? It's not Peña Nieto, it's Claudia Sheinbaum with her experience. And it's interesting because people often point to the fact that Trump is notoriously a very sexist man, and that how is he going to handle a woman being at the negotiating table with him, with Claudia Sheinbaum? Well, in fact, he was asked about that, not in those terms exactly, but what do you know about? And his first reaction was like, oh, I got along really, really well with Lopez Obrador, and he always makes the tongue-in-cheek comments like, oh, but he's a little bit more to the left of me, but we got along. And you can tell he sincerely actually liked Lopez Obrador. The two got along. There are a lot of reasons for that. We're not going to get into that today. But he actually said, and I hear that she's close to him. So I think if they're from the same team, that we're going to get along just fine, right? And I think that's a vote of confidence in the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum comes from his party. And then, in fact, she said during the morning press conference after their phone call that Trump sent his hello to Lopez Obrador. So I'm not too worried about that either. I also think that people who say that merely the fact that because the Mexican president is a woman, that it's going to be a terrible situation for Mexico, are in themselves being somewhat sexist. It's underestimating Claudia Sheinbaum, who's shown herself to be a very capable politician, an excellent politician, much better than even those who sympathize with her might have expected. And so the situation is not the same. 2024 is not the same as 2016. Mexico is in a much, much better position. The U.S. has been pursuing this tension with China for a long time, and that has brought consequences, namely in Mexico's benefit, which is really good in terms of this ongoing negotiation. And I think the final thing I would say to that is that China is a rival to the United States. Right? The world has changed. I think we can say with confidence now it's a multipolar world, and one of those poles is China. Mexico actually can play these two sides off each other, like we did during the Cold War, right? That's kind of the nine-aligned position of, all right, we'll pursue a favorable agreement with you, the United States, but we're not going to declare China an enemy. We can work with them, of course. And I think that actually puts us in a good position because the U.S. is not going to view us in the same way as it views China as something that threatens its hegemony on the global stage. We are a middle-income country, kind of a regional player. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can actually benefit from this tension that exists between China, and which is likely going to increase with Donald Trump as president.
Yeah, and one example of what you just pointed out is that China is going ahead with its BYD plant in Mexico.
For the Mexican market, which is important.
For the Mexican market, as we talked about previously.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think another point is that Sheinbaum is not backing away from helping out Cuba in its time of need. So that's a classic example of Mexicans' non-aligned policy that goes back to the Cold War. And that's not ending. And that's a sign that Mexico is going the non-aligned route, which it should.
The former ambassador, Sarucán, who was ambassador to the U.S. under Felipe Calderón, who's now a political commentator in Washington, he was like, oh, we're in danger now because it looks like Marco Rubio is going to be the Secretary of State, their canciller, their foreign minister. and oh, he's going to be his eyes on Mexico because of our close relationship to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, right? The usual kind of, like you said at the beginning, these people who want, it almost seems like they want things to go
it.
back.
Yeah.
And I was talking about Claudia Sheinbaum being a capable politician. And I thought there was a really interesting contrast here that I wanted to highlight for our viewers and listeners here. I put this tweet up of Chrystia Freeland, who is the Deputy Prime Minister in Canada. She's a very powerful figure inside of the Liberal Party, which is currently governing there. She's actually kind of repeating somewhat of her response to Trump in 2016. Similarly, the Liberals were still in power back then, of just kind of hitting the panic button. Of, they created the reestablished Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. Relations. She even compared it to COVID, saying it's going to be like COVID. It's about bringing in all these things, just clearly panicking at the notion of Trump. Compare that to Claudia Sheinbaum, who said, I'm convinced we will face the bilateral relationship with dignity and pride, knowing who we represent, our great people and this great nation, right? Of that dignity, of saying, I'm the president of Mexico and I'm going to defend my country's interests, and we will find places where we disagree and we will push back where we don't. And compare it to Chrystia Freeland, who's clearly scared. They're very, very scared. I mean, they're likely to lose the next election, so maybe that's part of it. But I think the contrast is just so clear. Two female leaders, one panicking, the other one showing dignity and pride. Quite the contrast, and why I'm also less worried.
Yeah, and let's repeat what we've talked about in the program. Lopez Obrador said, "Compared to me." Well, there's a whole other thing, right? I'm fresa compared to Claudia, right? And we've seen this in the Mañanera. She routinely shuts down people in the Mañanera, not, with authoritarian whatever, just with her demeanor, with her information, with her, very professorially. I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch her with Trump. I'm actually looking forward to it, not because of Trump, but because of Claudia.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this whole scenario, this election result, has actually invited something that I was praying. I'm not a religious person, but to use the term, hoping for would actually happen is finally happening. I did a presentation last night for a webinar. And I mentioned this, that I actually started off with this by saying, finally, the right questions are being posed. And this is it's actually kind of like a centrist account. There's nothing too much to dig into here, but I think it's telling of a sentiment. It's a shame they didn't pay attention earlier, what was happening in Mexico, but at least some people finally are. We have this tweet here from Armand, who says, the only post-COVID incumbent party that did well was AMLO's party in Mexico, and we should probably study why. Imagine that, Kurt. Maybe we should pay attention to this massively successful political leftist movement just south of us, quite literally on our border, that has shown what it's like to actually govern well, and expand your majority despite the media, the conservative forces, the entrenched enemies inside of the state, et cetera, global factors, slowing economy, whatever you want. Still won. What is it? Well, I thought I'd bring up this. You shared this as well. Your piece that we talked about in a couple episodes ago, Mexico's lessons for the international left. Maybe they're late to the party, but at least they showed up.
Yes, and this is something I've been screaming about in Jacobin for the last 6 years. Jose Luis's work, of course, as well, and Soberanía since February. And I think it would be nice if there were a degree of reflection on the U.S. left on this Olympic ignoring of Mexico over this entire 6 years, and if not ignoring, the outright scoffing from people saying, it isn't left enough for me. All right, well, how are you guys doing?
Yeah.
How are you guys doing? Sorry. Let's maybe have a degree of humility, and we can learn from the country that Jose Luis says is right next to us, right below the border, and has created a movement that has won in 2 landslides. And as we'll see with the upcoming new leadership from the right wing, has some good options to be able to continue along that path. But seriously, it's like, why can't you see Mexico? Maybe that's something that should be investigated a little bit more. Why is Mexico so invisible for you?
Fortunately, we're seeing that change. And, again, I mentioned this, that I was in a webinar last night, and there was a really quite sincere enthusiasm to learn more. So I hope that continues. I hope it isn't just a flash in the pan. I hope it isn't just, oh, right now, while everybody's asking and providing their postmortems and things like that. There have been some pretty silly ones out there, and I think they're worth bringing up quite briefly here. Just, people saying, oh, economic populism didn't work. That's actually what Biden did. I mean,
Oh, God.
if anything, the Mexico example shows what it actually means to engage with a commitment to the poor and the working class of a country. Sure, in some ways, Biden did this or that. He was, pretty good when it came to the National Labor Relations Board. The FTC chair was actually somebody who was actually progressive. There was the cash transfers during COVID, although let's not forget, remember, he promised 2,000 and ended up delivering only 900 or something like that, or 700 when he actually took office. So there was some of that, but it's not to the level, to the degree. I think one of the things that's important to pay attention to Mexico isn't just good policy, right? It isn't just, oh, the coffers are full, so let's spread the wealth. It's actually reorienting the economy, abandoning some of the neoliberal orthodoxy of the state playing a pretty important role in the actual economy, and not just as a regulator, but an actual actor. The mobilization of the population in favor of these policies, right? I think one of the things that hasn't been talked about is like, who's well organized and mobilized in the United States? It's not the left, except when it comes to Palestine. But mostly it's the right. It's the right that can show up and mobilize and demand and put pressure and call their politicians and all these kind of stuff. The Democrats is a purely electoral machine. All they do is ask you for money to run elections. There is no actual mobilizing. There's famously
an electoral machine. It's a fundraising machine.
It's a fundraising.
It's
a money laundering operation.
Yeah, it's a money laundering operation, and it's a job providing machine for wealthy, from their wealthy donors to a cadre of overpaid advisors. That's what it is. That's why you see nobody in the Democratic Party losing their jobs. Chuck Schumer, none of these people.
Which is
just
really
like
extraordinary
down here, right? Who lost their job? Who's losing their jobs when they lose? Nobody. It's very comfortable. What's the incentive?
What's the incentive?
It's the money making machine. And just to add to your point, just so very quickly on this, it's not just the Matthew Iglesias set and all these people, of course, always draw the wrong lessons from everything. And they say, oh, Biden was liberal and people didn't like it. The Biden administration did do some social programs, but only in response to COVID, and they were temporary. As soon as the emergency was over, they dismantled them. They dismantled them at record speed. The child tax credit, the expanded unemployment benefits, the expanded Medicaid benefits. The expanded Medicaid benefits just ran out before the election, and student loan payments went back. So there was this idea that the Democrats didn't really believe in these things. They were just temporary expedients to quell the population during the pandemic, and as soon as they could, they pulled the plug. Whereas the social programs in Mexico are permanent, they're going into the Constitution, they're rights, and they're part of an overall new vision for the country, which the programs during Biden weren't. They were seen as temporary COVID expedients, and they got rid of them as soon as they could. As opposed to AMLO's programs, all of which have been continued under Sheinbaum, and they're being built upon, and they're being brought to the constitutional level. It's a massive difference in the way you visualize these things, Jose Luis.
Absolutely. Those are the lessons. Pay attention to what's happening in Mexico. Are mistakes as well, although there are less of those in this instance in the comparison, but also, the ideological underpinnings of this project, I think, are also important, which, again, I'm not in a place to tell people in the United States what to do, but I do know that there's a lot of people asking if the Democrats are still the vehicle at all. And I do think that the Mexican experience there has a lot of lessons. Not only did they build a left of center party, they had to build a new one when that one failed to actually rise to the occasion and be the instrument for change. So, but there is change. There are things changing up. You mentioned the fact that there doesn't seem like there's a lot of consequences for the politicians at the top, but we do know, at the very least, that there has been some of the same attitudes from some of the politicians here, because like you said, I mean, they don't pay a price for their really quite worrisome and anti-patriotic positions. So I wanted to mention this before we move on, which is that, so Marco Cortés, the now former leader of the National Action Party, currently in the Congress, said that he wanted to invite Trump to classify organized crime group activities as narco-terrorism. Now, to bring people up to speed very quickly, because I know we've talked about this before, this designation is really worrisome because, first of all, it doesn't really quite fit. The FTO designation exists mostly to target organizations that have a political motive. Organized crime groups, narco organizations, if you want to call them that, are money making. They're businesses. They work in the illicit market, but they're businesses. So it's not quite the same. But the danger of this is that that kind of designation opens the door to one of Trump's most worrisome policies, the one that really does scare me when it comes to Mexico, which is the threat of unilateral military action. And some believe that with the designation, the FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, that the United States would have the so-called legal framework, questionably so, but would have the framework to engage in military action. That could be drone strikes inside of Mexico without Mexico's permission, or even boots on the ground. So Marco Cortés, a very prominent figure of the Mexican opposition, is, in a sense, calling for an invasion of Mexico. Is that treason? Your thoughts, Kurt?
Yes. My answer is yes. And this is part of a long history of the Mexican right and the Latin American right. And it's part of what has been such a leeching on Mexican sovereignty over decades and, much more, centuries. Mexico's right wing not believing in the sovereignty of its own country and always trying to run to a foreign power. It has debilitated Mexico constantly over the years, constantly. You would think the minimum baseline of any political party in Mexico would be to defend the sovereignty of its own country. Just the minimum baseline. And they can disagree on other things. Just the minimum baseline. But they don't. Mexico's right wing is openly playing against its own country. It's hard to overstate how debilitating that's been for Mexico over the years. And people talk about so many things. The Mexican conservatives after the Civil War in the 19th century welcoming in Maximilian of Habsburg, right? The PAN throughout the 20th century constantly clamoring for greater U.S. interventionism. And we see another example of it here. It's just pathetic. It's just sad and pathetic because Marco Cortés knows exactly what the terrorism designation would mean. If you think the U.S. doesn't already way overstep its bounds in Mexico, just wait to see what they would do if that designation came through. We've talked about in this program, right? We just saw what happened with the Mayo Zambada. They most likely came in and kidnapped a Mexican citizen and whisked him out of the country, right? Like third-party renditions we've seen what the U.S. does in other countries. Remember all the third-party renditions in the Bush era? They'd just go into a country, kidnap somebody, and they knew they couldn't bring them back to the United States because of the minimal constitutional protections that exist in the U.S. So they sent them to the Guantanamo Gulag. There were people there for 20 years that they then had to free because they couldn't prove anything against them. This is the United States. This is the United States. This is a country that kidnaps people routinely around the world and sends them to gulags like Guantanamo. That's the model they want to do here. To be able to freely come in and kidnap anyone, including elected officials. Imagine them coming in and just kidnapping someone from Morena because they can trump up something on them. Say they're involved in terrorism. This is Marco Cortés's world. Spy on Mexican, which they already do, of course. The drone strikes, the invasion ideas. It would be absolutely free reign if Mexico agreed to this. I mean, it's just absurd. It's nonsensical. But it goes back to what we said at the beginning of this program. The Mexican right wing is prostrate. They're utter losers. So they want Trump to do the job for them. They're trying to outsource their own political failure to Trump. They want Mexico to fail. They want Mexico to go badly. They want the United States to intervene on their behalf, just like they did with Maximilian of Habsburg. So this quote here on the screen from the analyst Sabina Perman is quite accurate. It's not an exaggeration in my view. Marco Cortés is a traitor to the country, and not just rhetorically. Cooperating as he does with the think tanks of the world right, and we've talked about them. We've talked about them, how the think tanks do the U.S.'s dirty work with very fat salaries coming through USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, right? What does it say there as to with think tanks with the international right, right? So that a foreign army devastates Mexico. That's it.
That's it.
And it's funny that Marco Cortez, just in the heat of some of the biggest debates in the Senate recently, just bailed out and went to Spain. And then said from Spain, I want to take license for a few days. Where was he? What was he doing over there? He just went off to Spain. Wasn't he supposed to be the Senate Minority Leader? From Spain, he asked for, license for a few days. Once he was already over there.
Once he was already gone. He doesn't even have basic respect for the country's institutions. I mean, somebody with a traitorous attitude.
Yeah. What do they care about Mexico? These people, as it's been said more and more, have much more to do with Madrid and Miami than Mexico City. They have much more to do with Madrid and Miami than in Mexico City. And they're traitors to the country. And the problem is Morena has made abundantly clear that they are. And instead of changing anything about it, they have just installed a new leader who is exactly in that coterie of corruption and entreguismo. And who is this new leader, Jose Luis?
Well, he is the head of the mafia that was involved with irregular building practices here in Mexico City. And guess what?
Whoa.
That isn't Morena saying it. This is actually the product of actually a long-standing investigation. We talked about it in other episodes where basically the residents themselves discovered all kinds of irregularities. We're talking about literally extra floors being built that shouldn't have been built. People being paid off by being given apartments, right? Everything is out of order. There's a lot of people who still don't even have the title to their own apartments that they paid for because of these irregularities. But it's not just the press that has uncovered this. Felipe Calderón, the panista president, one of the worst presidents of Mexico, wrote about it in his Difficult Decisions book about the new leader being a corrupt individual, Jorge Romero. And so, of course,
you can't make this up.
Exactly. Yeah. She didn't waste any time and brought this up, right? And we have here in the caption. In su libro, in this book, he says Jorge Romero of Mexico City, a former delegate of Benito Juárez, one of the boroughs of Mexico City, famous for his corruption cases where that constantly the extortions have revealed, et cetera, et cetera. A friend of mine and my nephew told me the day that he went to go work with him himself, he admitted that he had connections with the street vendors and other groups that financed to the tune of 7 million pesos a month. From the mouth of one of your own, from Felipe Calderón, from a panista, that's the new leader of the Mexican opposition. I don't think things bode pretty well for them. I think it's going to be more of the same. It seems it's a bit the gift that just keeps on giving, the Mexican opposition.
It really is extraordinary. They couldn't have come up with a worse replacement for Marco Cortez. There it is, right there. If you're watching this, you see it on the screen. If you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcast, it's a meme of Jorge Romero with his hand on the tomb of what was the PAN party. Romero summarizes everything that people hate about the PAN. A slick, wealthy, junior-like corruptazo who, as delegate in his time, knew all about what was going on with this corrupt real estate venture known as the Cartel Inmobiliario, right, the real estate cartel, and did nothing about it. And not only that, he was, according to what we see here, they're basically the ringleader of the whole thing. Look at him at the top of the hierarchy here. It's him, and underneath it's Santiago Taboada, who was the PAN's candidate. They picked some real doozies. The PAN's candidate for Mexico City governor in this election, who of course lost to Clara Brugada, and then a whole list of people who've been arrested and imprisoned. All the people marked in red there have been either arrested or on the lam for this.
I mean, this isn't political persecution, right? Like, these people committed crimes. They've been detained and prosecuted as a result of their crimes, and he's directly linked to them. And that's the guy who was chosen to be leader. Even when he was giving a press conference there, a scrum, somebody from his own party walking by is like, "You're corrupt." And he's like, well, he's probably not even from the pen. He's like, "Yes, I am." You know what I mean? Like, his own people.
It's like, you couldn't find anyone else. You couldn't find anyone. You couldn't find a bowl of gelatin to be the PAN leader who would do better. It would be better positioned than Jorge Romero. I mean, really.
They tried the Jello thing, remember? Xochitl Gálvez was selling Jello.
Sorry, that one's already been tried. But again, this summarizes all of the worst elements of the PAN, and it shows the extent to which the PAN is in the grip of its own organized crime syndicate, that they can't choose anybody else. The bases are not happy with this. What the minimal base that exists of actual party members of the PAN, because the PAN has really shrunk as a mass party. There are a lot of people who aren't happy with this. There's a lot of infighting in the PAN. Right? Remember, Felipe Calderon himself and his wife wanted to start a whole new party, and it just failed, so they had to go back crawling to the PAN. They hate each other in that party. They hate each other over there. The people in the bases hate the leadership, but they can't do anything about it because the PAN is an organized crime syndicate, as is the PRI under Alito Moreno. So that's all that they can come up with, because there's no mechanism within the party to have a clean break that they would really need to become electorally viable again. There just isn't. And there isn't in the PRI either. And until that happens, nothing is going to change for them. If anything, it's going to get worse. Because how can you go with a straight face to the country and say, we want to renew the country with a criminal, with the real estate cartel guy, that guy? He's worse than Marco Cortés even. He's more corrupt. He is. And it's just all out there. It's not hidden. I don't think, what do they think people are seeing? They think people aren't watching the news? They think people weren't affected in those apartments? Imagine building irregular apartment buildings, which had extra floors and didn't follow procedures and weren't up to safety codes in the largest seismic zone in the world, one of them. Just imagine the danger they're putting people in, besides the corruption of building irregular buildings in this massive seismic zone. What do they give a crap? They wanted the kickbacks. They get the kickbacks from all this. That's what it is. It's just, good old-fashioned graft. Build irregular buildings. Don't worry about the permits. Don't worry about the environmental stuff. Don't worry about the earthquake stuff. Just give us the kickbacks. And we're good, baby. And this guy's going to be the leader of the PAN. I'm here for this, too.
It'll be interesting to see if he actually implements any changes, so the leader of the party is the one who designates the leaders inside of the Congress, and there's different spaces and things like that. So it hasn't been clear. I'd also be interested to hear if he's interested in keeping up with this marriage with the PRI. Are they going to get a divorce? Or will Claudio X Gonzalez whisper sweet nothings into Jorge Romero's ear and convince him to keep with the charade of the so-called united opposition? Those, I think, will be the more interesting test. Will he represent much of a change, or is it really just another face on the same corrupt package that is the PAN? Okay, before we move on, I wanted to share this tweet from you, Kurt, because I really think it puts things in comparison. And you say it yourself. You want to go ahead and read it out. And as those people who are joining us in the video can see what's happening here on the screen. Kurt.
Well, this tweet is kind of a summary of what we've talked about in the show up till now. I said quite a week for the opposition this past week. Norma Pina, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, trying to do little tricks there. And what I mean by that, you can go back to our live episode, but just very briefly, the Supreme Court was trying to illegally overturn the judicial reform, and they needed a qualified majority of 8 votes to do it out of 11, to even try to do it, because it was unconstitutional. But to even allege that they were doing it, they needed 8 votes. So they lost a justice at the last minute, Perez Dayan, who made the principal decision to say, I don't agree with the judicial reform, but this is ridiculous, people. And he's a conservative. Don't agree with the judicial reform, but this is silly, people. Let's stop this. So they lost Perez Dayan, so they didn't have the 8 votes they thought they were going to have. So all of a sudden, Norma Pina pulls out of her sleeve, well, the judicial reform brings the Supreme Court size from 11 down to 9, so we don't need 8 votes anymore. We need 6. So I say it's 6 votes at the last minute, just right there in front of everybody. Everybody's like, what? You're trying to rule the judicial reform as unconstitutional, but at the same time, you're cherry-picking a clause from the judicial reform that you like to try to rig the rules in the middle of the session and say you all of a sudden only need 6 votes? Didn't work. But that was the game. So going back to my tweet, it was quite a week for the opposition. Norma Pina tries to play her little games in the Supreme Court, and Marco Cortés making himself, a mat. An abject mat, rug mat for Trump. So the message is clear. We're tramposos y traidores, right? We're tricksters or shysters and traitors. Meanwhile, here was Claudia Sheinbaum's week, right? She had this lovely moment with this little girl who came up during her speech in San Luis Potosi. Instead of chasing her off, she had this real kind of a genuine photo op where the girl grabs the microphone and starts saying, "We're here with the presidenta." She had a little trouble pronouncing presidenta, but there it was. And then she ran over on the podium, and then she came back, and Claudia said, "This is going to be the next representative for San Luis Potosi in Congress." Right? So it was a very photogenic moment for someone who the press continues to say is stiff and wooden.
Yeah. What was it that Sochi called her? Ice Queen or something like that? Is one of the debates?
Tried that one in the debate, yeah.
This is what I mean. She's gotten better. I didn't see Claudia being so natural with a child a year ago. She's gotten much better. The closeness to the people actually has helped her. This is not like kind of a paternalistic, like, oh, look, we're going to go do the photo op and this little girl's going to run up, right? Like stage kind of a show. No.
Yeah, this was clearly an on-stage moment that she had to react to, right? Because if you kind of shoo away someone, I mean, that doesn't hurt.
Yeah. And like, it can't be overstated. That means a lot, right? Like there's a lot of little girls who are watching that and saying, yeah, why not? I could be president. That is significant, right? Again, I don't want to fall into identity politics traps, but I was moved when I saw that because I know that there's a lot of people who can take a lot away from that, to feel inspired and to see the difference and to have a different style of governance, and having a woman like Claudia Sheinbaum with her history, her trajectory, her skill set in the office of the presidency. It's great to see. Okay, so that's a perfect segue to our good news of the week. And this is about a new program, kind of building on the successes of Sembrando Vida, Sowing Life, which is a program aimed at ensuring people stay in the countryside, giving them incentives to plant trees. It's also environmentally focused, to attend to the emptying out of the countryside, the abandonment of the countryside that happened during the neoliberal era. It's, again, in a lot of ways, it's one of the more popular programs. Often people talk about the pension for seniors, but this one's actually pretty key when you think about the rural context and what it means to be able to have these incentives to stay in your communities. We're seeing revitalization of some communities as a result. So they're going to grow. There are going to be more efforts on this. And this one is called Cosechando Soberanía, or harvesting sovereignty. I like the term. When we were going in our pre-production meeting, what are we going to talk about? I was like, it's got to be this one, harvesting sovereignty. What's it all about, Kurt?
So just a little bit of history, and we've talked about some of this before, right? One of the multiple negative aspects of NAFTA in its time was the incentive to small producers to abandon the countryside and to immigrate, because they simply couldn't compete against subsidized U.S. agribusiness. Repeat, subsidized U.S. agribusiness. These small producers were, thrown to the wolves in Mexico. So the tragedy, I came to Mexico in '99 first, was to see, I've been living in Oaxaca, I've been living in the South, how abandoned the countryside was. You just see abandoned, left and right, cultivated fields that people just weren't farming anymore. What was the incentive to do that? And the Clinton administration knew this very well, which is why the security, border security was heightened in the 90s, right around the time of NAFTA. They had to know what was going on. And actually, there was documents reveal that they did know that there was going to be a wave of post-NAFTA immigration, largely from the countryside. So there's that. And there's also the point that sovereignty can't just be energy sovereignty. It also has to be food sovereignty. And that's also a foreign policy point. If you are feeding your own people and if you are providing energy for your own people, you're in a much stronger foreign policy position to be able to be that non-aligned player that we were talking about at the beginning of the program, to be able to play the world powers off against each other. Mexico is in an interesting position as a regional power, and that's why the Wolfowitz Doctrine, going back to Paul Wolfowitz, saying we will always try to suppress regional powers, precisely because they fear that regional powers can do this. They can punch above their own weight by pitting off the big powers, the massive powers, against each other. That's why they always are scared of regional powers being able to punch above their own weight in that regard. So check out the Wolfowitz Doctrine if you're curious about that.
Well, and the way that the lack of food sovereignty has been weaponized, for example, in the case of Cuba, in the case of Venezuela, right? Because these were countries that had different kinds of economies for different reasons. Take Venezuela, for example, right? Oil dependent, largely imported its food. So when the crisis came and then it was made worse by US sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, they literally had a problem feeding the population because they couldn't afford the dollars anymore to import the foods and things like that. We see here on the screen, food sovereignty is the compass of the fourth transformation politics in the countryside.
It's so important. I want to read just a little bit of what this says here, because this began this is another example of how the second floor of the fourth transformation is building on the first. The first already had Sembrando Vida, the tree planting program in the countryside. It already had the free fertilizer program, and it had the price supports program. That was already in place. Now, the Sheinbaum administration is adding the program to provide healthcare, Seguro Social, to day laborers, which we've talked about in another of the good news segments. And they really want to go after the day laborer segment because they're the most precarious part of the informal economy. And then this program, what it says is these new programs seek to generate a virtuous circle. On one hand, the small and medium-sized producers will receive quality seeds, technical assistance with all the capacity from the federal government there, care for the soil so it doesn't get overused, and an efficient use of water for irrigation. This is something that's been pointed out to me, that a large part of the water waste in Mexico is through irrigation in the countryside, because they haven't been modernized the irrigation systems in Mexico. So you see a lot of times there's been the abuse of licenses by large multinational corporations, as we've talked about. But a lot of this water gets wasted in irrigation, and to receive a fair payment. On the other hand, they will be offering good quality products to the population by means of the well-being stores and free of deforestation. So there's a basket of products that they want to make Mexico self-sufficient in. And the first one that they want to make Mexico self-sufficient in is beans, because Mexico imports 30% of its bean consumption.
Which is extraordinary if you think about the role it plays in the diet, right? Tortillas and beans is a major, major part of the Mexican diet.
Huge. So they want to start with beans, but then they want to go to corn, onions, tomatoes, chiles, wheat, sorghum, rice, cacao, coffee, and milk. This is all part of the basic basket of the Mexican diet. And it's the saddest element of the whole post-NAFTA era, that the civilization that created corn, remember, corn does not naturally exist in nature. Corn is a hybrid created by pre-Columbian civilizations in Mexico. It was invented by pre-Columbian civilizations, a lot of them in the Oaxaca Valley, where I've been living for 25 years. Mexico, which brought corn to the world, then became dependent on corn imports. And through the corn imports, of course, they sought to open the door to GMO corn in Mexico. And this whole battle over the last few years has been to keep GMO corn out for human consumption. And that's one of the constitutional reforms that's going on. Unfortunately, they're not doing that for animal feed, because Mexico isn't yet self-sufficient enough in corn for animal feed. That's part of this whole program. That's part of this whole program right here. And it ties into agribusiness. It ties into the whole GMO thing. It ties into the whole glyphosate thing that Mexico has been trying to ban. And the United States is like, oh, you got to use glyphosate. It's a free trade issue. They always try to bring it to the arbitration panels of the TMEC. And Mexico's saying, no, this is part of, this is our national tradition here. This is corn. This is the country that brought the civilization that brought tomato to the world. This is the civilization that brought all those degrees of chili to the world. Go to a Mexican market. If you go there for an American who's only used to seeing one kind of corn, one kind of tomato, one kind of chile, just go see the abundance of the different kinds of chiles and the different kinds of corns and the different kinds of tomatoes in a Mexican market. All sizes, all colors, all varieties. And you see the variety of what nature can produce, and you see the limited nature of what you get in a U.S. supermarket. It's really sad, actually, when you compare what you see it get in a U.S. supermarket to the abundance of a Mexican market. And the U.S. is trying to put its thumb on that by shoving agribusiness products down the Mexicans' throats, which is why this whole thing of providing seeds to small producers is so important in this program, Jose Luis.
Yeah, and I'm really encouraged by this. I know when Verdaguer, the secretary, was named, there were some concerns because he has a history of working with agribusiness, but this is a really good sign. I mean, this is exactly what we've been talking about. This is the state intervening to make sure that key foodstuffs are available, providing the stimulus, providing the supports, providing technical assistance, the seeds, right?
Mhm.
Aiming towards, as I said, here, this is our compass is bringing us towards food sovereignty. It's really quite interesting to see this concept of the tiendas bienestar, or the well-being stores, where food will be more affordable, more accessible. And in one part that I'm looking here on the screen that really jumps out at me as well, which is so it's about increasing the principal foodstuffs, but it's aimed mostly at 1,175 municipalities with high levels of
Yes.
poverty and also lots of potential production. So it's about going to, again, the famous phrase, the poor first, and going to make sure that they are the ones who are being serviced by this program, not the communities that already, have found some kind of equilibrium with the new reality in this free trade world.
And 2 points that are really important to close this out. The first point is, why did Kamala lose in the US? In part, it's because the Biden administration underestimated the effect of inflation on the American consumer, the US consumer, and said, oh, the economy's fine in macroeconomic terms, stop complaining. Basically, it was stop complaining. We're doing really well. And a lot of US households said, well, we're not doing very well. So what does these tiendas de bienestar do? It fights inflation. It fights inflation because if you have good quality foodstuffs coming from Mexico, not imported, that can go right to the Mexican consumer at lower prices. That's where a large part of inflation has been since COVID. It's been in the foodstuffs and the food chain. So it fights inflation, first of all. And second of all, it fights organized crime. Because organized crime, and I can't state this enough, has diversified its operations over the last years. This is part of the awful legacy of the Calderon war on drugs. They've diversified their operations. And one area in which they diversified their operations is into food production in things like avocados, because they know how big avocados have become in the US, so everybody can have their avocado dip for the Super Bowl. So all of a sudden you see producers in the countryside being forced to plant avocados, and avocados being a big organized crime operation. So if you have a setup where small and medium producers can have government support to provide a diversified range of products, that also fights organized crimes efforts to diversify their own operations in the countryside, husbands.
That's a really good point, and something worth highlighting. I mean, this is the strategy that the government is employing about attending to the root causes, about having the presence of the state where they weren't present, where this vacuum allowed organized crime groups to proliferate. So we'll look further that. And she does mention here that they will be talking about this program and Sembrando Vida, Sowing Life, at the G20 in Brazil. As we know, López Obrador was trying to expand this program, see if there could be an implementation of a similar type of program in Central America. This is obviously a flagship program for the government. And they'll be talking about the G20, which is coming up in about a week. And of course, we will be talking about it because it's Claudia Sheinbaum's first foreign trip as president. So it'll be exciting. Interesting that it's the G20, where it's a multilateral forum and not a direct bilateral meeting with, say, the United States, which is often the case. So I'm encouraged by that as well. I think that's also important, symbolic in Brazil. It's important to always look to the south, as we always say.
Actually,
here.
in Brazil, Lula said we really want Mexico there. That's part of why. Yeah. That's part of why she's going.
Oh, good. So you can see the regional alliances as well. Shudder the Notion there, Paul Wolfowitz. Really, really a throwback there. I haven't heard that name in a while, Kurt. You're making some of our older viewers and listeners feel their age. All right. So on our last one is Losers and Haters. And this one comes from the Financial Times. Trump's radical second-term agenda set to test Mexico's fragility. President Claudia Sheinbaum has limited leverage, despite the country being the largest trading partner of the United States. By Christy Murray here in Mexico City, Michael Scott in London. So, wow, Kurt, this headline sounds totally contrary to everything we just said. Could it be that we were wrong this whole time and actually Mexico is really fragile and doesn't have any leverage and Trump is going to destroy this country and we're all doomed? What's going to happen, Kurt? I'm scared.
Yeah, I guess there's always that chance, right? That the Financial Times is right about Mexico when we're wrong. I guess you got to kind of weigh that. And if you've been following the Financial Times' coverage of coverage under quotes on Mexico over the last 6 years, that's par for the course because that's what they're seeing. That's what they're seeing. They're seeing a fragile country that hasn't gotten any better and has actually gotten worse in the authoritarianism and this and that and the other thing and the welfare programs which they don't like and this and that. So of course this is the way they're going to see it. And of course this is also the financial press's way of trying to undermine the Mexican transformation. Surreptitiously, of course, without coming out and saying it. They're saying, oh, Mexico's fragile because their programs basically haven't worked, so Trump's going to mop the floor with them. So what does it say in the article, Jose Luis?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because this is a great example of the way who you're interviewing, what prominence you're giving their comments. It's all very telling in terms of the ideology behind these outlets like the Financial Times. For example, this former Deputy Foreign Minister, Andres Rosenthal, saying, I get the impression that it's going to be a lopsided relationship with the Americans demanding constantly more from Mexico and Mexico being unable to commit or even make a major difference. So, I mean, if you believe Rosenthal here, you might as well just throw in the towel. Give the gringos whatever they want. We can't push back. There's no leverage here. But they live in a fantasy land if that's the case. I mean, just rewind this episode about 40 minutes and you'll hear us talk about the reasons why that's not true. I mean, it's trying to look at things in the worst lens possible, but it's actually also separated from reality. That's not the situation that Mexico finds itself in. It's actually in an advantageous one. Now, of course, Trump has made very specific
point out, Rosenthal is just a washed-up, recycled hack from the Cedillo and Fox administrations, right? But they don't tell you that part.
No, they just mentioned he was former. Oh, he must have some kind of authority, right? So at the end of the campaign, Trump certainly did start talking more about Mexico. And he mentioned that he's like, well, if they don't do anything about the migration and the crime, I'm going to threaten them with 25% tariffs. And if they don't do it, I'm going to raise it to 50. And I'll go all the way up to 100 if I have to. Sure, he did make that threat. But those threats are, I think, there's not a lot of weight behind them because of everything we talked about, because it would lead to inflation, because it would lead to economic recession, and that would drive more migration towards the United States. And that's the last thing that he's going to do to his supporters. He's not going to raise the prices of consumer goods and create a scenario that invites more migration to upset the very base that just elected him. It's very, very unlikely. I mean, do I think that Trump is going to use it as a tool, as he did with López Obrador?
Yeah, yes. As a threat, as a bully club. Right.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But we weathered that, right? In worse circumstances. We'll be fine when it comes to this new round of challenges. And the whole article just kind of goes on, right? Like all of the relationships, it's almost even the way that they phrase it, right? Sheinbaum said, little to far she plans to deal with Trump, other than there was not a single reason to worry about the country's good relationship, other than that there was not a single worry. So imagine the president who dialogues with the press and the public every day, goes out there and responds to the question and says, no, like as we highlighted early on the show, we're going to do this with dignity. We're going to defend our country's interests. But that is just, there's nothing to worry about, as if she's not a serious actor in this, as if she doesn't know what she's talking about, that she isn't going to be capable of handling these challenges.
Yeah, it's exactly it. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the program, right? They want Mexico to fail. It's in their own business interests. So, they want to see Trump do this. This is kind of wishful thinking on their part. It's not objective reporting. And it's curious because I've seen people say on Twitter, actually the business press is much better at reporting than some of the other corporate press because their investors really want to know what's really going on. So actually look at the business press first rather than the other corporate press. Not in the case of Mexico and Latin America. Their own biases just overwhelm that completely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the same Financial Times that was saying that governors back years ago during AMLO should disobey AMLO, right? And kind of basically disobey against the federal government. And that multinational powers were going to have to do a run on the peso in order to discipline AMLO. This was the Financial Times. And when that didn't materialize, they were frustrated. And they're frustrated that their efforts to undermine the Cuatro T up till now have not worked. So they want to outsource it to Trump as well.
That's right, which is something we've been warning about constantly. So be vigilant on that. One final note, I think there is an interesting point made in this article here, which is that U.S. an ambassador to the U.S. has not been named. It'll be interesting to see who Sheinbaum picks, because I think that's important. I think largely the U.S.-Mexico relationship is going to be navigated by the economy minister, Marcelo Ebrard, and he's obviously experienced with this, and he's actually quite capable when it comes to that. But one final note here, I'm really disappointed. Everything I hear from Marta Bárcena, the former ambassador to the United States, has been really disappointing, kind of taking this line.
Become very sour on the whole thing.
Yeah, she's really quite soured. I mean, she's got a think tank gig, right? She's beltway brained at this point. But interestingly, she says, I see many more changes in the U.S. public opinion that is seeing Mexico less and less of a friend and more as a national security threat. I mean, that's straight out of Ryan Berg's mouth. That's the kind of position she's been taking. So, I mean, it helps us understand why she was not so ceremoniously removed as ambassador earlier on in the fourth.
And just to make a final point on this, we've talked about places where there's conservative entrenchment, and there was conservative entrenchment in the National Electoral Institute, and they still have a majority of 6 on that council, but they don't have the director anymore. And the conservative entrenchment in the court system, which is why the judicial reform is so necessary. Another area of conservative entrenchment in the federal government is the Foreign Relations Secretariat. That hasn't been cleaned out at all. And there's a lot of functionaries going back to before AMLO there, and a lot of conservatives. And certainly a lot of people have a very neocon view of the world. So if you want to understand why Mexico hasn't had, for example, a better position on Israel-Palestine, for example, that, of course, the responsibility lies with the top, or why there hasn't been good treatment of migrants in the consulates, and there's been constant complaints about that. Look to who's staffing the Foreign Relations Secretariat. That's another area of conservative entrenchment in the federal government.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to highlight here, it's interesting how even now, 2024, Trump wins again. They still don't get him. This comment here, the Mexican leader's hard left credentials are also unlikely to endear her to Trump. That's not how Trump works. That's not how Trump has shown himself to be when he's
not ideological.
He's not that ideological. I think it's really quite silly, right? And again, to go back to Bárcena, right? They will not be happy with Mexico giving oil to Cuba, helping Maduro. That will be another big point of friction. So what? Mexico's a sovereign nation. We conduct our own foreign policy. We don't give a shit what the gringos have to say to that. Looks like Marco Rubio is going to be the Foreign Affairs Secretary there in the United States, the Secretary of State. I'm sure it probably bugs him. Too bad. Get over it, Marquito. We are a sovereign nation. We're going to conduct our business as we see fit, as we should. And on that note, that brings us to an end. Another episode of Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm Jose Luis Granado Ceja. As always, I was joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, any last words?
You can see the pink behind me. A new day dawns in Mexico, and we're off to cover it. So we'll close for now. We'll see you next week for another edition of Soberanía.